All righty. So we are at the end of the course. We're going to be doing the course summary, final prep, as it says there on the slide. Obviously, the slide's not going to change because I'm going to be going through aspects of the test and also talking about other parts of the course. So uh, yeah, not the most exciting one. In fact, YouTube sometimes will throw this one out because it says the slide number change or the contents, whatever. Just part of the deal. But I will have it posted here shortly. Um, Other things you should be working on, obviously the term paper. I think I've gone through that a couple times. I think it can really be something to help you out in terms of coming up with a plan. Additionally, your homework, get that turned in so you get that podcast review type thing, and then not too many homework problems. And then just go through and look at the rest of your records. One thing I always want to caution students about it's they'll look at their grade, and sometimes with the grade calculations, the way Blackboard does it, they'll go, "Wow, I don't even need to do the term paper. I can still get an A." Yeah, no, it doesn't work out that way. The problem is that Blackboard doesn't do a calculation until there's a grade entered for that course, for that, assignment. So for example, let's say you decide, I'm going to skip the term paper. You don't fail the term paper. You don't get like a 50%. You get a zero, which is obviously 50% worse than just 50%. So turn something in. Obviously, the easiest thing to do is just do the assignment, but a poorly done assignment is not going to have the same impact as a non-submission. And then people go, wait a minute, I had an A going in there, and I did my math, and yeah, your math and Blackboard math are not the same. But anyway, um, on a more positive note, that we're going to go through, we're gonna kind of summarize the course. We're going to talk about certain aspects of the test, and again, I'm not teaching you the test, but I kind of pride myself on the test reflecting the more important bits. So by summarizing the more important bits of the course, we are essentially talking about the test. So certain things we talked about insurance quite a bit. My main point here, this isn't a testable item because it's more of an opinion item, but just be careful with salesmen and commissions and all that kind of stuff. I've got a brother-in-law, as I might have mentioned before. He does quite well. He owns a winery. He does really well, and a lot of his income is from a lot of health insurance and life insurance policies he sold way back when. But every time those people renew, he gets a commission, and that's somebody's. That's kind of a transfer of wealth. That's some of your savings. I'm not saying all life insurance and all health insurance are scammy, but you know, the commission situation it really impacts your ability to save money when it's ends up being a vehicle for somebody else's um, finances. So, but one thing on insurance that we did talk about that is testable is the concept of the beneficiary. And some of these terms are important. We talked about perils. That's like fire, hail, things like you want the most general. You do not want a policy that's specifically written for one individual peril. You're like, I don't care what happened. The house is destroyed. I need it fixed. The car is destroyed. I need it fixed. Now, there are certain limits, as we talked about with flood insurance and earthquake insurance. Sometimes those are, you might think you've got coverage, but unless it's specifically delineated, you don't have those coverages. But another term is a beneficiary. Beneficiary is the person par- primarily in life insurance because you know you're not around. You're the person who's getting the policy, but the beneficiary is the person who the proceeds from your policy are going to end up with, since the only way you can collect is by passing away. So anyway, um, another thing here. We talked about bonds a certain amount. I feel kind of guilty about that because I really don't like bonds, but and situations change. There's certain aspects of personal finance that work great. Warren Buffett, super genius for his time. In the dot com and any of the high tech stuff that's been in process for a while, yeah, he's those type of things, his approaches would work. So things change over time. So you have to be a bit fluid and keep up on things. But if you do happen to get involved and it is a good situation, you decide it's a good situation to purchase a bond. If you see a convertibility function or feature on a bond, that means that bonds can be changed into stock. So a bond is a debt position, as you know, and a stock is an equity position. A bond essentially is a glorified loan, and a equity position, you know, based upon the definition, is an ownership position. You didn't give them a loan, you bought a portion of the company. Another thing with bonds is one of the drawbacks is a thing called the call feature. A call feature on a bond, as it pertains to that, is if you're getting a bond, and again, it's a competitive marketplace. If they're offering you, say, 8% on a bond, they're not doing that because they want to. They would much rather be down closer to the prime rate and things like that. They'd much rather be paying a lower rate, but based on the market, the quality of the company that's taking the bond, for some reason they're forced to offer a higher rate. And if there's a call feature, um, what that means, let's say economic conditions change, and they can now easily sell bonds that don't pay an 8%. They can sell bonds, that pay a 4% all day. So they're going to want to get rid of that high price debt. And so, in order to do that, they would execute their call feature, which they can do if it was included in the contract that you had. And in case they call the bond, that just means, okay, here's your money back, say the 20 grand or whatever you put down on the bond, and the deal's off, the contract's off. You're good with your payments that we paid you so far, but we're not going to take this thing out to maturity. So it's not a positive feature for the investor. Um, Here we have a document that modifies a policy. So this is more of a general term. It can be modifying any contract, but insurance policy is essentially a contract. And so when you have a contract that's already written and you want to make certain additions to it that are, different than the standard, there's a thing called a contract rider, which is it's an addendum to the contract. They'll also use other terms that you probably will never hear again called codicil and things like that change the policy. Most of the time, they can do that also in terms of wills. They can modify a legal document with these other documents. Eh, with word processing, this was new 50 years ago. But anyway, there's no need to really write extra things on the contract. They can usually write out a new contract. But for example, if you have a whole bunch of jewelry or photography equipment or guns or something that are above and beyond what the standard policy will cover, you may need to get a rider. And you want to make sure, the important thing is you want to make sure that if you have some expensive items that they are indeed covered. Just to go, oh yeah, they didn't ask about it, so I'm sure it's covered. That's why those policies are like 30 pages long. If you read somewhere in the fine print, you'll find something about, jewelry's covered up to a limit of $1,500 or something trivial. And if it's all destroyed or stolen or whatever, you're going to be not happy. Um, Mutual funds are no loads. That's all you're interested in. There's no need to pay a loaded fund. If you're going out and they're offering you, I don't even know what they offer. It used to be crappy TV sets or timeshares or something like that. Anyway, and they're trying to incentivize you to invest, and it's high pressure tactics, and there's a percentage that you're paying, to invest in this. That's all a load. You can go on 90% of the sites now and not pay a load. So if you are paying a load, you're really putting yourself at a disadvantage because getting back to time value of money, that load, that commission is going to be paid up front and it's going to put you at a severe disadvantage. Kind of applicable to this right now are a lot of these things on the podcast where you see them selling gold and they're selling gold or precious metals. And They act like they're selling them at the spot price. The spot price is the price that, well, it's something you want to pay as close to spot price, the listed price, as you can. But any place you go, like let's say you're in Anchorage, whatever, you go down to um, Oxford Assay or someplace like that, and I don't even know, I'm not a gold guy, but let's say gold's trading for $4,500, and then we'll have some sort of split where they'll buy your gold, but they're buy it for 44.50 or something. They got to make some money somewhere on it. And if you sell, mm, anyway, you know what I'm talking about. It's going to work out where they make a bit of commission. I'm not going to embarrass myself by trying to guess some. Basically, if you want to buy, uh, the price is going to be a little higher. And if you want to sell, the price is going to be a little bit lower. And fair enough. That's what keeps the heat and the lights on at their place and incentivizes them to do business. My point is that some of these guys like that William DeVay, that old actor, or some of these other folks that are peddling um, precious metals. Ugh, sometimes their markups are like insanely large, and they'll try to finagle it a bit, but when it gets right down to it, the price of gold's got to go up, by at least 50% before you're even positive, because you're paying all these commissions and stuff up front. So if you choose to invest in precious metals, knock yourself out. But don't buy it through something that's where you're paying, you want to pay as close to spot as possible. You want to pay as close to the actual rate, and not pay a huge markup. Um, Mutual funds, we've talked a bit about mutual funds. Mutual funds are an equity type investment for the most part. And the reason you would do this is just for ease of purchase, and just ease of use. Very customer friendly investments. Typically, they're comprised of equities. And if you had a mutual fund that is comprised of equities that are growing corporations with higher than average revenues, that would typically be, if you were going to label that family, that would be a growth mutual fund, as opposed to an income mutual fund. That would be more established companies that are paying a dividend, they're paying an income. Money market, I'm looking at some of the bad answers, some of the wrong answers. Money market, that would just be based on government treasuries. It's going to be, it's going to pay you every month, but probably not at the rate of inflation. So you're not actually making money. You thinking you're making money when you look at the statement. Oh, I made $30 or whatever, but the buying power of that money went down by $50. So it's not, it's very secure, and it's a more of a parking place than an actual investment. Um, Here's a mutual fund that's specialized. It's all in high tech, or it's all in defense, or, you know, they can delineate it however they want, but those are called sector funds, where they pick a specific industry primarily. They can also be done geographically, but um, pharmaceuticals and other things that may or may not, be interesting, might be where you work out. Here's another one on mutual funds about um, what's the basic concept of a mutual fund? It's a way to gain diversification. You get a lot of investors, and they invest in a variety of securities. So although there are certain stocks that do quite well, you're probably better off investing across a number of stocks, so you aren't tied to just one company. Companies, a lot of times, you don't know what's going to happen, and sometimes you don't want all your eggs in one basket. Basically, the mutual fund gives you a chance to spread things across. If one company happens to have, let's say you're invested in, the fast food sector, and you've decided that, clearing away that, I don't know, I don't eat much fast food, but let's say McDonald's is, they're the leader. We're going to go all in with fast food. But we're going to put all our money in McDonald's, and McDonald's has some horrific E. coli, you know, outbreak, and people are dying, and all of a sudden people start going to the other competitors. You were right in guessing that fast food was going to do well, but you had such a concentration on just one company, it left you vulnerable. You could have probably invested in a mutual fund that say had Taco Bell and McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King, the rest of them. So again, um, I wouldn't get diversification just because, and especially, if you are somebody who's a fast food connoisseur, if that's even a thing. um, if there's, you look at the mutual fund, you look at the prospectus, and you go, wow, these guys got, you know, 30% of their money all in, you know, whatever Arby's or something like that company's not going anywhere. Why are they doing that? I don't think I'm going to invest in that one. Anyway, so you still have the ability to look at the individual underlying stocks, but just the same, maybe Arby's comes out with a new product. Maybe McDonald's goes south with their E. coli thing, and all of a sudden, Arby's props up. Anyway, it's an easier and a safer investment a lot of times by pooling the money of many investors to invest in a variety of securities. So it's kind of strength in numbers. We didn't talk much about this. This is sort of an insurance thing. Let's say you got a kid that's a bit of trouble, right? You go out of town for the weekend, and your child, who's maybe under 18, would be under 18 in this case, notices the neighbor's not home and puts out a big thing on whatever whatever the social media of the day is to say that there's going to be a huge party next door, and just trashes the neighbor's place. Yeah, those neighbors are probably going to come talk to you. And there's a situation called vicarious liability that you're going to find out about, because since that child was a minor under your control and they did this, yeah, you're responsible. So vicarious liability, it can transfer to a lot of things. I've had this with silly animals. I had a pig get out on the road. Anyway, kind of a grisly situation, but because it was my pig and it was supposed to be under my control, the little Bronco that hit it or whatever, uh, the insurance sorted it out. But yeah, even though I wasn't the one getting hit by the Bronco, I was responsible. Strange. Uh, Here we've got we're doing stock trading, and we don't just want to do a market order. If we do a market order, we're just going to take the price that's out there right now. Execute now is basically what we're saying. If we're saying, it's trading for, you know, 35, but it's been dipping down to like 33, I think it's going to happen again. Pardon me. And you can say, yeah, I'll put in an order to buy 100 shares, but it's going to be a limit order if it hits 33. So if the stock stays at 35, goes to 36, whatever, you don't have an order. But once that price drops to 33, your limit order converts to a market order and will probably get executed. So uh, stocks that sell for less than $1 are called penny stocks. And these can be pretty sketchy. Number one, because they're not very big companies. Who knows? Especially like in the high tech sector, 9 out of 10 companies fail. So if you think you've got this company, and this gets back to mutual funds, and you put this concentration of wealth, you've done the absolute opposite of a mutual fund. You've not only, I mean, you could win big, and that's how venture capitalists win. And that's when they go, oh, wow. They took a whatever $1 million investment and they turned it into $1 billion, they should be taxed it. Yeah, well, the reason why they're venture capitalists is 9 out of 10 of their investments don't work out. So when one does work out, if you're Peter Thiel or somebody, you need to make sure when you're right, you're very right and you make a killing, because most stocks are not going to do that. But anyway, penny stocks, they're down below a dollar, typically not regulated by the Securities Exchange Commission. So you can get screwed pretty easily, and you can get a lot of false information. There's not, real Wall Street analysts looking at it. It's kind of below the radar, very much subject to pump and dump. But anyway, the title for anything trading for less than a buck is called a penny stock. Um, Another thing we talked about with insurance, and this particularly has to do with auto insurance. Let's say the state of Alaska, um, and this applies to all states, but let's say you've got somebody who's got, a reckless driving and a DUI, but they did little courses and they've been judged that they're good to go. Insurance companies are like, yeah, but you know, this guy's a loose cannon. We're not really comfortable insuring this person. In fact, we don't want to insure anybody like that. We only want the people with great driving records. Well, this person is probably still going to drive, and now they'd be driving without insurance. So that's not a good situation either. So states will make an agreement with the insurance companies that want to do business within their state that, yeah, they have to, you can insure everybody in the state, but if you want to do business here, you got to take some of these, whatever, the not so strong swimmers. You've got to take some of these people that tend to, crash now and again. And you can charge them quite a bit. You can set the premiums quite high, but yeah, you've got to. So it's called the assigned risk pool, and it just means that, yeah, as a condition of doing business, you got to take some of our less distinguished drivers. Um, we talked about a will, bit about that. A will is a legal declaration in terms of the person's mind and body, all that. A will is a necessity. The thing with a will is you don't do it verbally. It's got to be done in writing. It's got to be signed by a lawyer, and it's done within the state. So if you, it's very, very important. There's a lot of people who don't do wills, and again, that is not a good thing. If you die without a will, that means you died intestate, and that's the legal term. The court that handles all these issues is called the probate court. It's a state court. So if you write a will, you'd want to keep it quite general. That way it doesn't need to be modified. You don't have to specify, I want this property at such and such address. No, you can just say all my property, and you can say, the property's going to be turned over to my children. You don't have to put names, you don't have to put specific addresses. And if you do that, if you keep it pretty general, unless you've got some, specific need, then that will last quite a bit longer. And until you move out of the state or perhaps get remarried, that will endure. But it's got to be done by a, a lawyer or paralegal, somebody like that. You cannot do it yourself. Now, there's inexpensive ways to get it done because it's not much of a process for the lawyer. And there's things called paralegals, which are sort of like lawyers, but they work at a much reduced rate, and they would be recognized. But it's got to have witnesses and the whole 9 yards. But very, very important. Um, anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that in some of these other questions. Here's a lady. She's got some shares. She's this is just a word math problem. She buys it for one price. Um, she sells it for another price. How long did she have it? If it's greater than a year, then it's a long-term gain. If it's less than a year, it's a short-term gain. Did she pay a commission? If she had a commission, if she made $1,500 on the stock sale, but paid a commission, then that commission is subtracted. And then the other thing is if she received a dividend over the years, that's going to be added to the profit side. So anyway, you can go through and you calculate out the capital gains. Pretty straightforward. You won't need anything high powered. You can use a calculator for this, but you won't need to know any formulas or anything like that. Here's a guy, he's thinking about investing in a stock, um, looking for something relatively large profit, but he wants to make it a short amount of time, so kind of get rich quick. So that's not a T-bill. I'm going through the bad answers. A UST bill. That is absolutely not a get rich quick scheme. Certificate of deposit. Now, sort of the same thing, but usually with a time limitation on it. Low growth stock. That's not a thing. Nobody's looking to get low growth. They may say balanced. They'll come up with some better marketing name than crappy stock, but that's kind of what they're saying with low growth stock. And then low risk bond. Again, low risk is not going to get you high yield, and bonds typically don't have those kind of yields. So the one remaining answer is a speculative stock. And so we've talked about speculation versus investing. Speculation is that sort of extreme bit where you're trying to get rich quick, and that's not typically what we consider investing. Maybe it's what you could do if you had, a bit of extra money at the end of the month once you actually, paid money into your investments for your retirement and you still had some money, but speculation and investing are not the same. Here's a lady. She paid some amount of money. This was for a doctor's appointment, but it could be for a doctor's visit. It could be for a vehicle. That amount of money that you got to pay before your insurance kicked in, that's called the deductible, right? So if your car gets damaged, there's $5,000 worth of damage, but because you've got a $500 deductible, the insurance is going to cut you a check for 4,500 and you suck up the rest. Here's a um, question that's it's I mean, I'll keep it in here. It's still the overall strategy with things like gold. See, gold is supposed to be a kind of a flight to freedom type investment, where when things are getting a little shaky, gold prices tend to rally. Um, and so, if by the opposite, if there's a decrease in tensions, gold prices should decline. So right now we're kind of in a war and gold is not going up. I mean, it is kind of going down slightly. So um, it's kind of throwing things off. But let me give you the right answer because I'm confusing you a little bit because this is preached as gospel and personal finance, and there's some exceptions. And let me give you one more exception as long as we're on it. Silver and gold are both, they have industrial uses. Silver has a lot of industrial uses, and gold's a superconductor. So although it's very expensive, there are still certain, you'll even see it, very thin gold plating on some electrical devices. So those industrial uses make it kind of, demand, supply and demand. If the economy really goes down, sometimes demand for gold and silver and the precious metal uses will go down as well. And so it's not always just people get nervous and gold goes up. People get calm and gold goes down. That's the right test answer, but in reality, it's a little more complex. So let me read you the actual question and kind of give you the answer just so there's no confusion. Easing of international tensions or disinflation is commonly said to cause gold prices to decline, but often can be reduced by industrial demand for the material. So decline is the word. And it does encompass what I'm talking about, but I'm just saying gold prices, they don't, it's not as rational, it's not as linear as they would make it sound in that question. All right. Estate planning. Estate planning has to do, so when you retire, you're saving for your retirement, you're enjoying your retirement, you're still living. But unless you've timed it absolutely perfectly, there's going to be some money left over. Hopefully. I mean, well, actually, the best case scenario is to have the check to the funeral home bounce because you're completely out of assets. But that's very scary, right? You still have to eat, rent, pay your taxes, do all that stuff, and you don't know exactly how long you're gonna live. So in reality, there's a bit left over. Well, once you pass away, that becomes your estate, right? So estate planning involves a bunch of different things. And part of it is, yeah, taking care. You've got to, while you're still alive, you set these things up, whether you do some estate planning to make sure, you know, if and when, well, you will pass away at some point, but when you pass away, things transition orderly and also don't get eaten up by taxes. Now, unless you're a pretty high wealth individual, the estate taxes are generally pretty low. But anyway, it all has to do with what's going to happen after your death and as opposed to retirement, which is when you're still alive. We talked about leverage, financial leverage. That has to do with using borrowed money for investment purposes. So if you do that for crypto or, you know, speculative stocks, yeah, that's foolish. You're that's not smart. But to do it for real estate, that's just the way it's done, especially if it's cheap interest rate. And that's kind of where we're at right now with the boomers are holding on to the real estate because they got all these loans that are, you know, 2.75 or less than 3%, and they don't want to move on them. It's not costing them any money. And so, um, but if you've got loans, typical mortgage loans now are still, in the 6, 7 range. So it makes it unattractive. But anyway, the concept of using borrowed money for investing is leverage. All right. Um, in terms of when to start saving for retirement, when should you do that? As soon as possible. Save whatever you can. And again, you can borrow against it. And so, yeah. Um, but there's some misconceptions in retirement that your costs will go down, you'll be cheaper, all your expenses will be paid by Social Security and Medicare. Not the case. You've got a pension. To make the assumption you've got a pension is foolish at this point. So anyway, uh, here's an example for insurance. So it's some redundancy here. Person who's got an insurance policy and they've got a bunch of photography equipment, and so they're going to have some sort of floater or rider or addendum or codicil. There's so many different terms for the same document. In this question, they're calling it a floater, but they also say rider. So don't worry about that. Here's a person who died without a will. What do we call that? Intestate. So remember, probate's the court. Um, Codicil's another term here in the answers. Codicil is kind of like a rider, a floater kind of thing. But no, intestate is that term. And the problem with that is it's going to get backlogged in the court. They're going to have to hire more lawyers. And you're dealing with a court system that is not, you didn't take the proper measures to have a will or do any of that. So they're not really going to rush in to get everything right with your account and make everything great for your beneficiaries because you didn't really care. You didn't show that you had to put any effort into it. So they're not going to do anything either. Uh, Here's a guy that, let me see, he's got a will. It's going through the whole process after he's passed. And that process, as we said, is called probate. That's the court system that deals with the settlement of wills. They do have some mutual funds that have a life cycle to them. And what they do on these life cycle funds is they can get a mutual fund and say when you're younger and you can handle some volatility, you're probably best in growth stocks, right? And you're going to take a little more risk. And if it goes down, you know, doesn't matter. You're not going to be using this money for 20, 30 years anyway, so it's worth the taking the risk. Well, later in life, you probably want something a little bit more stable. You maybe have 10 years to retirement. And then getting right up close to the end, you're nearly retired, so you don't want to take much risk at all. So they'll get these life cycle funds that do that transition automatically through the fund. And so they'll pick a date like say 2055 or something like that. And that would be, based upon your retirement date. And it will cycle through these different types of investments throughout the course of the fund. So it's an interesting product and it's sold. But if you see a life cycle fund, that's what they're talking about. That again, it's just another type of mutual fund that will try to do that. Here's an interesting question about bonds. We've talked before about bonds, how the value of the bond changes over time. Because you can take a bond, let's say you get a $20,000 bond, and it's paying say 5%. It'll pay 5%, every year, and at the end of the term, you get your 20,000 back. And so you got all those payments throughout the course of the years, and then you get your original investment back. Now you can sell that bond beforehand on the secondary market. You can just sell it as a financial instrument. But let's say it's a 5% bond and the new bonds are paying, 7 or 8%. So your bond is not that attractive. People would rather not buy your bond. They'd rather buy a brand new bond and get that higher interest rate. So if you go to sell your $20,000 bond in the secondary market, you might get offered 17,000 or something like that. That might be the prevailing rate. Conversely, if your bond is paying, you know, 6% and the new bonds being issued are only paying 3 or 4, well, your bond also seems more attractive. So you might be able to sell that bond for 21, 22,000. So that's how interest rates change. So the value of your bond will increase or decrease based upon its interest rate compared to the current market. So, let's see if there's any more. Yep. If you die without any will, anything, you die intestate. We're kind of hitting this kind of hard. But if you die without any documentation at all, there are certain, states' laws of descent and distribution. They'll just go with the default. Well, he didn't say anything, so everything goes to his spouse. Oh, not married? Okay, then everything goes to the kids. Doesn't have any kids? Well, pretty soon it's going to end up with the state. They're like, giddy up. We just put it in the general fund and it becomes almost a tax. And maybe that wasn't what you wanted. You wanted it to go to your, long-term relationship person or your child that whatever. You wanted to go somewhere different. You need to put that. You don't want to die intestate because you can't make any alterations. If you die without a will, it's going to go by what the state standard is, and there's no modifications after your passing. Um, when we talk about real estate being illiquid means just like this was pretty heavy on the midterm. Liquidity has to do with the ability to turn something into cash quickly. Illiquidity is obviously not liquid. So that means that real estate, the reason why it's not considered liquid is because it's not that easy to sell. It doesn't sell that quickly. It's just hard to turn into cash quickly. Um, why do you have life insurance? To fill the financial needs, that were left by your absence. By the person who took out the policy was probably the breadwinner, the person bringing in the money. And since they're gone, your life insurance should fill that void. Here's another like a word problem where they're buying stock, selling stock, buying for that price. Another one, these are getting not repetitive, but on the different types of stocks we're talking about, um, growth stocks are stocks in smaller companies that are growing at a fairly high rate. A blue chip stock, that's more of an established company. Blue chip, it's just a jargon, but it's used quite commonly. But those are be big established companies. Are typically paying a dividend, so they'd be an income stock, not a growth stock. Here's a guy who's bought a car and he's making sure it's got all the safety devices on it, front, side airbags, anti-lock brakes, all that stuff. He's trying to reduce his risk, right? Can he avoid the risk? No. If he's still driving, he's not avoiding it. Assuming the risk means that you hire some insurance, you pay for some insurance and you have somebody else take over that risk. And but anyway, risk reduction would be things you can do to mitigate to reduce that risk. How do they determine life insurance premiums? It's kind of grisly. They have mortality tables. They go, oh, this person's this age. They've had whatever. They're a smoker. They drink. They've been in this number of accidents. They've been, yeah, we think that person's gonna, you know, pass away at this age, and they're frighteningly accurate. It's kind of scary, but that's how they decide what the premiums are, and that's why they get quite a bit more expensive as you get older because your propensity to die are quite a bit higher. If you're young, you can get term insurance quite affordably because the numbers prove it out that yeah, your chance of dying is quite low. Here's a guy, he graduated from college. Young, what kind of stock should he be in? Corporate bonds, kind of boring, not high yield. Government bonds, even more boring. And again, boring is not quite but it's just not enough risk. It's not gonna build the wealth that the person should be building. Commodities, now we're getting to speculation. Buying copper or oil, some commodity. That's a bit much. Money market fund, again, very, very conservative. Money market means generally government securities. But growth stocks again are probably where that individual needs to be. Um, Health insurance policies, most come through the employers. That it just works out better that way because the employer can get a group policy, and it's just more efficient, and it's recognized as traditionally a perk of working for a company. Here's a based on historical performance, which one's going to provide 10% per year? So um, it's not going to be corporate bonds, T-bills, any of that. Stocks, the regular equity markets are the ones that are earning, proven to get you about a 10% per year. Um, I talked before about a mutual fund where you were trying to, you know, you were going to invest in some fast food sector mutual fund and you wanted to see the details and their holdings, what companies they actually owned. Where you would do that is in the prospectus. So that's a legal document it lays out the rules for that mutual fund that you're investing in. And whether it's electronic or given to you as a hard copy, you have to acknowledge that you've read the prospectus prior to investing. Um, we've talked about inflation, and that's just where investment does not keep up with the prices. So prices are going up. You're making a bit of money, but if it's not keeping up with inflation, then you've got inflation risk. Annuities, annuities are annuity. The name is in the title there. They're sold as an insurance product, or at least through those types of folks, because they're a little more complex. There's different variables to them. But an annuity, it's kind of the opposite of life insurance because With life insurance, you have to die to collect. You know, if it's life insurance, the person has to pass away. Annuity and that type of investment, you invest money. Let's say you invest 10,000 bucks and they pay you, say, $100 a month from now till forever for the rest of your natural life. So if you happen to die a couple years from now, that wasn't a great investment. But if you live for another 40 years, that could be a remarkable investment. So that's how it's defined as being the opposite of life insurance because it pays as you live. Um, you gone ahead and you bought some individual stock in a company. You know, you're a shareholder now, and they've got your address and all that. Now, it's not a necessarily a democratic process. It is, but it isn't. Let's say there's, a million shares of Coca-Cola or something out there. Well, not, it's one share per vote. So if you've got 100,000 shares, yeah, they're going to invite you to the shareholder meeting and all. If you've got 10 shares, you're going to get a letter in the mail that's a proxy saying, yeah, you don't get to come to the meeting, but you can designate somebody to vote on your behalf. They can act as your proxy. So if it's a company, then you want to, because you are an owner, so you do get a say based upon the number of shares you own and how that company conducts its business. And but for most of us, we don't own enough of a position, so we just get a proxy thing in the mail. I typically throw them away because I don't have enough shares to make a difference. Um, Here's a thing where a guy is making money and he's pretty disciplined and he's got his self set up in his budget where he sets aside money for investing as if it were a bill, pays that up front each month. So that yeah, that's called paying yourself first. So it's a great way to put away that, you decide what portion, say it's 10, 15% of your income is going to go into savings. You make that a regular bill, you pay it, and that's paying yourself first. Um, Sometimes we've talked about employee match. Here's let's say you've got a company, and if you invest um, in if you buy stock or contribute to your 401k, the company will oftentimes have a match. And typically, let's say you put down, 2% of your salary and the company will match it with 3%. It's a great thing. It's a way to increase your income. And, you know, it, the company likes to see it because it shows some longevity that you're planning on staying with the company because they don't, if you quit tomorrow, they take their match back. But if you stay 5 years or whatever to the point where you're what they call vested, then you get to, you know, take not only the money you've invested, but also the money they've matched it with. And anyway, it's a good program. If there is a match to offer by by your company, you should probably do everything you can to take advantage of it. Getting back to insurance, if you're careless, um, not only can you be found liable, but you could also be found negligent. If you didn't take reasonable care, um, things are going to go much worse for you. You may be responsible for the damages if, say, that ladder falls off your truck and it hits somebody. But if it wasn't even tied on and you knew about it, you just hoped it didn't fall off. Yeah, there may be some other charges, other damages that the lawyers will be able to seek based upon your negligence, your carelessness. So you did not take reasonable care. Um, Here we talked about different types of businesses. We talked about being a full partner and a limited partner. If you're a limited partner, if you're in that category, your losses are limited to only your investment, which is a good thing. If you're a full partner, you're on the hook for everything. Say you invested $10,000, but the company loses even more, you could lose your $10,000 investment plus $10,000 of your own personal money. So if you're getting involved in a partnership and investment, and you know you, you see that option for the limited partner. Now, again, it's going to preclude you from doing any sort of management. You can't say, we should be doing it this way, that way. No, if you start getting involved in the management, you've given up your limited status. But if you have your limited status, it's going to be better. We talked about a peril in terms of insurance, and that's the cause of the loss. So fire, theft, hail, flood, whatever. Um, Here's somebody who's buying a mutual fund. So this is not a growth fund because they're buying something that's going to be paying a long history of paying dividends. That's an income fund, right? The dividends are classified as income. So this company is not using their profits for growth. They're not building new buildings and stuff and expanding. No, they've got these profits and they're paying them back to the investors. Um, Talked about liability. Yep. Um, Liability means you caused harm to somebody else. You're responsible, you're liable for your actions. We did discuss renter's insurance. Renter's insurance has to do with uh, protecting your items within the home, within the apartment, but just the items. It does not, include the structure. So it's usually pretty affordable. Here's a lady who's got a home. She's got a coffee maker that's been shorting out, sparking, and all that kind of stuff. That coffee maker now presents a hazard. That's what it's going to be classified, in insurance speak. And if you allow that hazard to continue, yeah, you may be found negligent. But the fact that you've got a problem, that is a hazard. Um, Here's a person, they've got a chunk of money. They don't want to put it all in one basket. They're going to put some in large caps, some medium caps, small caps. They're going to spread it around, keep a little bit in cash, some foreign stocks. That's diversification. So, again, you don't want to take this to the extreme. I'm not going to diversify. I hate bonds. I'm not going to buy bonds. I'm not going to say, oh, I'm going to buy some bonds so I can say I diversified. So you can, but if there's competing investments, then maybe, yeah, you want to spread it around as long as they're all good investments. Some may be higher growth, some may be lower growth, but as long as the risk is relative, um, it'll position you in a better spot. Um, we talked about with the S&P 500, we talked about beta. What happens is when you've got stocks that are volatile, it's kind of hard to define volatile. It's again, it's like being in the ocean and saying, the tide is high or low. It's relative to the land. So because everything is kind of going up and down in the water. And so you need some measure of volatility that's tied to something else. Well, in the financial world, the S&P 500 is what they've established as beta. So it's it's the big boat out there that's floating around. And if a wave hits it, it may move just a little bit, not much. But a small boat that goes raising up with every wave, that would be a higher beta. That moves quite a bit. And everything's moving, but that one moves at a higher rate than that big ship. Conversely, if there's even a bigger ship, it may have a lower beta, so it may be a zero point 0.5 or something compared to the Standard and Poor's 500. So beta has to do, it's a measure of volatility. So if you're looking for a high beta stock, it's neither good nor bad. It's just an expression of the volatility. Like crypto is very, very volatile. And so um, to measure crypto against the stock, let's say more like maybe Nvidia. Nvidia compared to the S&P 500, Nvidia is going to go up and down quite a bit more than the general S&P 500. Um, Turning investment into cash, that is called liquidity. We talked about bond ratings, how they work, how the numbers go up and down, and the letter ratings. And in this case, AAA would be the highest rated. But keep in mind, if you get down to the B range, you're getting down into junk bond range. So the grade scale is completely inflated. So AAA is the highest, and they don't even talk about D. Well, D bonds are actually in default; they're flat, not paying. B ones are considered high yield or junk bonds because they're still paying, but there's a likelihood that they may go into default and decrease further. Um, Financial cost or responsibility for another person's injury. Again, that's liability. We're familiar with that. Another word problem on investing over time. Just do the calculation, look for dividends, look for commissions, and subtract those things out. What can you use life insurance proceeds for? Basically, whatever you want. You can pay the estate taxes that might be due. You can pay off the home, fund an endowment, charity, quite a bit of stuff. Let's say you've got a stock, and for example, I mentioned this back when we were talking about Nvidia, and the stock was just going up in price and up in price, and it was up around $1,800. That is just such a large amount for an individual stock. It just makes it ungainly. It's too hard to work with. So what they did was they did a 10-for-1 split. And so they said for each share that you currently own of NVIDIA, as of such and such a date, we're going to issue 10 stocks for that. So your number of shares is going to go up, but their value is going to be, divided by 10. So you're going to have 10 new shares, but they're worth 1/10. Each one is worth, so it took their share price down to 180 or whatever. So it made it much easier. Did you make any money on that split? Not really. I mean, the numbers stayed exactly the same. It's indicative that the company's doing good things, but the actual split didn't generate any wealth. But that's how stock splits work. Um, Another question on that. We talked about bond ratings for stocks that are, or for bonds that are in default. That is a D. Um, we talked about real estate again, liquid being illiquid. Um, what happens? This is just general stuff. Back when we were back in car insurance type stuff. If you actually get in a car accident, do you want to sit there and discuss who's at fault? No, you want to make sure people are safe, and surely any injuries are treated. There's some sort of medical help is on the way and the rest of that. But discussing, oh, it's my fault, it's your fault, it's not useful. Do not do that because it may harm you later on. Um, Mutual funds incredibly popular. Yeah, about half the households in the United States have mutual funds. There's more mutual funds than there are individual stocks. So they have tremendous amounts of wealth, tremendous amounts of assets under their control, assets under management. Um, which investments have the greatest growth potential? So we've talked about any sort of government type stuff. Very safe. We've talked about bonds in general, corporate bonds in this case. maybe a little higher yielding than the government because the government's perceived as zero risk. Corporate bonds, they might have some more risk. Um, and then we talked about bank accounts not paying enough interest to even make it worth it. So the only one of this group, to see which one's got the greatest potential, and there's common stock in there. Stock is obviously the answer. Stock can get you averaging around 10% per year. We talked about how liquid real estate is. So again, if you know one answer, you're going to do pretty well because there's some repetitive nature in here. We talked about inflation risk. We talked about term life insurance back when we were doing that. You had these whole life and all these different types of policies that have to deal with, oh, well, they're just more complex. And then you have term. Term is very easy. You pay a certain amount for a certain time for a certain coverage. It's quite straightforward, quite inexpensive. So it just gives you protection for a specified period of time. And if that kind of gets you through those years when you're vulnerable, when the house isn't paid off, when the children are young, all that kind of stuff, they can, you know, provide a great utility. Just a couple more before we call it quits here. Um, the difference between mutual funds and stocks, mutual funds depend on what what the underlying stocks are. They don't necessarily give you a higher rate of return. They just give you more diversification. So maybe, you could work this out to where you want to get the high return from investing in the tech sector, but you're a little scared to buy individual stocks. So maybe you invest in a mutual fund that is comprised of that tech sector. Maybe you're more comfortable doing it that way. It's showing some diversification and a little, uh, greater chance of spreading out your risk, but there's no guarantee with any of them. Yep, we talked about stocks being equity positions and bonds are debt. Bonds are just a loan by another name. Who needs life insurance? People that are going to be greatly affected. Not some single guy, not some single person living with their parents, not a dual income couple. No, the person who needs it is, the person with small children and a non-working spouse. They're going to be greatly affected if you move on, and so that's why it needs to be covered. Social Security, you can depend on it to pay your basic, maybe not. You know, if you're still renting, Social Security may give you, a couple grand, 2,500 or something like that a month. And if you're renting a house and you're expected to eat and pay for insurance and fuel, I mean, you're probably not going to make it. You want to have something in addition to it. When we talked about car insurance, we know what collision is. Collision covers your own car when you're at fault. Liability, the other person's coverage will cause it if he's at fault. Um, but there's that comprehensive. Comprehensive is the one that covers, windshields and glass breakage, stuff like that. So comprehensive is kind of the cats and dogs kind of category. And that's about it. So there's 72 questions all in. So we talked about a lot of different material. I know it's kind of difficult to focus on, what aspects, but uh, I just reviewed the questions that will be on the exam, so you should be pretty focused if you listen to this. Um, the final, your term paper, the homework, they're all kind of due at the same time. So all at the end of the term. So you got a bit of time, but not too much. I've got the dates out there set for the entire final period. And let me check something real quick. I can go in here and look at the test options if it does that for me. Trying to, no, it's not going to give it to me. So it's going to be the whole final term, but I will post an announcement with the specific dates on it. But you can take it anytime during finals week and get that done. Get all your assignments turned in. Just look through and again, do not be one of these people who go, oh, I don't have to turn that in and I can keep my A. It probably won't work out that way when the final calculation is done. Anyway, hope you got something out of the course and hope the rest of your finals go well.